Don't doki doki panic, it's just episode 1 of Game Boy Works Advance. Yes, another Works chronology. My goal is ultimately to have series running for as many classic handheld systems as possible, with forays into standard consoles, beloved genres, and maybe franchises. Will I ever finish any of these chronologies? No, but in terms of history, the early days of a console are always the most interesting anyway. And at the very least, there's value in being able to compare and contrast the birth and evolution of the 3 different Game Boy families. Anyway, Game Boy Advance had an incredible library. It was a critical part of my becoming a professional in games media, and I want to create videos about it, which is kind of the point of this whole endeavor. Video works and the related books are the thing I enjoy creating the most. I can't exactly make a living doing this, but exploring the history of classic games and systems makes life better. Nintendo spent a good half-decade pulling together a proper successor to Game Boy. Although it's hard to know the precise timeline, it appears that Nintendo shelved its plans for a full-color, 32-bit portable console around the time Virtual Boy went pear-shaped. With Pokémon becoming an unexpected hit, Nintendo was able to squeeze a few more years of life out of the original Game Boy hardware before refreshing their product lineup with a juiced-up color upgrade. By the time that 32-bit system launched as Game Boy Advance in 2001, the market was good and ready for a super-powered handheld. Nintendo certainly delivered, but their choice of first-party launch titles was every bit as conservative as their approach to handheld hardware had been. Game Boy Advance's Day 1 titles from Nintendo were awfully reminiscent of their Day 1 titles for Super NES more than a decade earlier, which in turn had been echoed by the Nintendo 64 launch lineup. Of course, GBA's overall launch prognosis looked considerably more impressive than either of those predecessors, thanks to the presence of nearly 24 third-party releases on launch day in Japan. Still, it's hard not to look back at Nintendo's own offerings and wonder if maybe the company was getting stuck in a bit of a rut. Take as a case in point, Super Mario Advance. By this point, a Day 1 Mario game was pretty much a given for a Nintendo system. Since the American debut of the NES, Mario had accompanied every single Nintendo console to date. Super Mario Bros., Super Mario Land, Super Mario World, Mario's Tennis, Super Mario 64, the exception being, of course, Game Boy Color, but that got Wario Land 2, which was descended directly from the Mario series. So, naturally, Super Mario Advance was a given. But where Wario Land 2 for Game Boy Color being a hasty half measure of a color conversion was excusable for a hasty half measure of a color system, Mario Advance's patchwork nature is a little harder to justify. After all, GBA was the Game Boy successor, with vastly more power, higher display resolution, and some impressive under-the-hood capabilities. And yet its flagship title was a Frankenstein's monster of an 8-bit update, and yet another convoluted chapter in the history of the game with the most tortuous legacy in Nintendo's entire catalog. It says Super Mario Advance on the box, but in point of fact, this is Super Mario Bros. 2, the NES game. Nintendo essentially sold this new portable system with a revamp of the 16-bit remakes of a port of a 13-year-old conversion of an odd license title. This is a strange tactical choice on the surface, though maybe not too hard to explain. Super Mario Bros. Deluxe had been a huge hit for Game Boy Color the year before. That was a direct adaptation of Super Mario Bros. For NES, with its Japan-only Famicom Disk System sequel, Super Mario Bros. 2 The Lost Levels, included as an unlockable bonus. Mario Deluxe had suffered a few compromises in its move to Game Boy Color. It looked identical to the NES game, and it handled perfectly, but the system's reduced pixel resolution versus the NES made some of the more advanced platforming challenges unreasonably difficult for anyone who didn't have the stage layouts memorized. But it sold well, and it only made sense for Nintendo to follow up with more handheld conversions of the vintage Mario franchise. And with Game Boy Advance launching, it only made sense to put those conversions on this new hardware. And so Super Mario Advance, Super Mario Bros. 2, or Super Mario Advance, Super Mario USA if you're in Japan. It's simultaneously a nostalgia trip, a tech demo for the new system, and a bizarre reinvention of a classic. In short, there's a lot going on here. Super Mario Advance doesn't simply slap a 16-bit facelift on the NES game. That had already been done with Super Mario All-Stars back in 1993, and while it probably would have been easy enough for Nintendo to simply ship that version and call it a day, they went all in here. The core of Super Mario 2 remains intact. There are still 20 stages laid out exactly as before, and all 4 members of the Mario 2 cast return with their individual traits distinguishing them as usual. Mario's the all-rounder, Luigi's sky-high jump makes him the trickiest to control, Princess Peach, née Toadstool, can hover momentarily when she jumps, and Toad is fast but terrible at jumping. As before, lifting and throwing both enemies and objects serves as the core of the action mechanics, setting this adventure apart from every other Mario platformer ever. But Super Mario Advance also takes notes from the game that Mario 2 was originally built around, Yume Kojo Doki Doki Panic. In that game, each of the 4 characters had to run through the entire adventure on their own in order for the quest to be considered complete. That's not quite the case here, but Mario Advance does carry forward Doki Doki Panic's world map display. And once you complete the game, you can go back into each level to replay them and hunt for the 2 newly added forms of hidden secrets, Ace Coins and Yoshi Eggs. And unlike in the NES game, you can save your progress anytime. Not only that, but the save file retains all the lives you've accumulated to date. Boy, do you accumulate lives. This version of Super Mario Bros. 2 differs pretty radically from its 8 and 16-bit iterations thanks to one major change: the addition of a scoring system. The American Mario 2 had been unique among Mario games for a lot of reasons, but especially because it had a lack of score tracking. There was neither a point system nor a stage timer in the game, making for a more laid-back, exploratory adventure. A sensation reinforced by the complex level designs which often looped or doubled back on themselves. While the level structure is preserved faithfully and there's still no timed element here, Super Mario Advance incorporates a pretty traditional Mario scoring system. Basically, every action you take nets you points, and that means wiping out multiple enemies in a single move results in point multipliers, and of course, 1-ups. Super Mario Advance also throws in quite a few other new 1-up collecting opportunities. Most of the hidden rooms inside jars have been redesigned, and many contain 1-up mushrooms or else tools that can easily rack up extra lives when used outside, such as POW blocks and red shells. Of course, all the original methods of earning extra lives remain intact, including the slot machine bonus chances you activate by collecting coins in subspace. New to the slot machine here is the option to wager on a spin, potentially multiplying a successful spin many times over. Extra lives and free saves aren't the only way in which Super Mario Advance is considerably easier than Super Mario Bros. 2. The entire game has been tweaked to be far more forgiving to players than both the NES and Super NES versions were. Namely, it's hilariously easy to earn health replenishing hearts now. In the original game, earning hearts to refill your character's energy meter was pretty tough, as hearts would only spawn for every 8 enemies you defeated. In Super Mario Advance, hearts appear constantly. The conditions to make them appear can be as simple as plucking specific vegetables from the ground. Kill 2 enemies in a single action, and hearts appear. Sometimes you'll even find hearts just laying around on the ground. And most obviously, interacting with just about any of the elements newly added to this version of Super Mario Bros. 2 appears to generate hearts as well. Super Mario Advance takes a page from Yoshi's Island, applying all kinds of spinning and scaling effects to in-game objects. In Yoshi's Island, those gimmicks were meant to show off the Super FX2 chip. Here, they're showing off the power of the base console. The player characters have additional frames of animation, objects rotate and skew as they move around, and 1-ups explode in a burst of fireworks when collected. You'll find strange stretching and warping effects in the background, with elaborate carousels appearing in certain hidden jars, secret objects hidden inside protective bubbles, and seemingly random stage elements springing to life when you least expect it. Plus, there are a bunch of giant-sized enemies. These super-sized enemies aren't any harder to defeat than normal foes, they're simply twice the normal size and take a little longer to lift. But if you toss a giant enemy without it colliding into another interactive stage element, it'll spit out a heart as a reward for every throw you complete. On top of that, each stage now contains 3 life mushrooms, allowing you to potentially boost your max health to 5 points instead of 4. The proliferation of health and health refills makes Super Mario Advance almost laughably trivial to complete. Super Mario Bros. 2 could be tough due to the scarcity of hearts and the fact that you could only continue twice, but Super Mario Advance is tuned to be completed by pretty much anyone. In fact, the greatest challenge you'll face in Super Mario Advance is putting up with the voices. Oh god, the voices. Clearly intended to show off the sound sampling capabilities and increased memory capacity of the GBA, Super Mario Advance gives all the playable characters voices. Bosses too, but mostly the playable characters. They absolutely will not shut up. Every single action Mario and friends take is accompanied by a scratchy voice sample. These range from mildly tiresome to utterly obnoxious. Sadly, Toad, my favorite character, gets it the worst, with a raspy shriek of a voice that activates anytime he jumps, collects an object, or unfortunately does what he's best at, digging. The ear-splitting chatter smothers the game and undermines whatever beneficial effect the developers were intending to show off, which is a shame because Super Mario Bros. 2 has always had such great music. It's worth noting that this isn't the first chatty edition of Super Mario Bros. 2. Super Mario Advance appears to take some of its creative cues from a Japan-only broadcast game for the Super Famicom's Satellaview attachment called BS Super Mario USA Power Challenge. The Power Challenge was a limited, timed event game in which players competed to complete specific challenges using set characters. Much like the infamous BS Zelda remakes, this was accompanied by live vocal narration. And while the BS game code has been salvaged for emulation, the live voice commentary only exists as low-grade VHS cassette recordings made by a handful of people who thought to tape these events. All told, Super Mario Advance incorporates elements of 4 different versions of the same game: Doki Doki Panic, Super Mario Bros. 2, Super Mario All-Stars, and BS Super Mario USA. Then it combines them into a bizarre mishmash of a game. I don't know that I'd call this the definitive version of Super Mario Bros. 2, but it does effectively summarize what the Game Boy Advance would turn out to be: a hybrid of old and new, sometimes freewheeling, often bizarre, but entertaining despite its occasional missteps. It's also worth noting the Extra mode included in Super Mario Advance, a 16-bit style remake of Mario Bros. Seemingly included to provide some sort of multiplayer feature, the Mario Bros. Mode riffs on the original arcade game and the competitive rendition featured in Super Mario Bros. 3 on NES. Rather than target arcade accuracy, the developers instead created something more akin to a Super Mario All-Stars overhaul of Mario Bros., with more detailed graphics and a few new gameplay elements. It's a nice bonus, but given that it would be included with all 4 Super Mario Advance games and Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga, and ports of the NES version would be reissued as both an e-reader card and a Famicom Mini standalone cart, you can understand why many former GBA owners take Mario Bros. For granted these days, or worse, view it as a nuisance. The GBA version of Mario Bros. Does feature one critical gameplay difference from previous versions. Mario and Luigi no longer jump in fixed arcs. Instead, this version incorporates the most important physics change implemented in Mario Bros. Super sequel, the ability to steer the heroes in midair. This represents a pretty considerable change for a limited game focused primarily on jumping. However, the increased control the new Mario Bros. Brings to the table is offset by a significant limitation: you can't see the whole stage at once. The GBA's screen resolution of 240 by 160 pixels was a huge leap over the Game Boy and Game Boy Color's 160 by 144. But it still fell well short of the 256 by 240 resolution seen on NES and in many of Nintendo's arcade games. Rather than redesign the stage layout of Mario Bros. To fit the reduced vertical resolution, Nintendo just cropped the view and added the ability to shift the camera up and down with a shoulder button. This is also present in the Super Mario Bros. 2 remake aspect of this card, but it feels a lot more critical here, especially once things start speeding up and enemies become more varied, around 10 stages in. It definitely cramps the fun. The irony is that Super Mario Advance opens by bragging about the GBA's screen resolution. The title screen lead-in shows the playable quartet making their entrance framed by a window that crops the screen to Game Boy resolution before fading away to full GBA res. But the need to ratchet the view up and down here exposes the lie. But GBA wasn't quite the handheld Super NES Nintendo wanted you to think it was. Despite all this, Super Mario Advance is a pretty decent, albeit strange package, but maybe not quite the game to make new GBA owners shout.
Just what I needed.
Next time on Game Boy Works Advance, it's the best kind of party, a third party.